I took the job because I was starving. I stayed because of her. That was my mistake. They say love conquers all, but at Sector 7, love just makes the teeth sharper. Richardson sits in the sterile room with the gray suit, who smells of antiseptic. He signs the NDA, ignoring the biological risk warnings because he sees the 3 zeros on the paycheck. He drives into the deep woods where the trees block out the moon. He arrives at the gate and meets Donald, a man with a face carved from granite. Richardson notices the razor wire on the fences is tilted inward. Donald spits tobacco and unlocks the gate, but he points to a massive dent in the steel plating of the outer door. "He tried to get in last night," Donald says. "The king is restless." I hadn't eaten a hot meal in 3 days when I walked into the recruitment center. Hunger isn't just a pain in your stomach. It's a noise. It's a constant, low-frequency hum that drowns out your pride and your survival instincts. I was living out of a rusted, '98 sedan parked behind a defunct strip mall in Louisville, waking up every few hours to run the engine just long enough to stop my toes from going numb. I was 25 years old, but I felt ancient. I was a ghost haunting my own life, invisible to the people walking past me on the sidewalk, existing only in the foggy reflection of store windows. When you live like that long enough, you become hollow. You stop being a person with dreams and start becoming a problem to be solved, a statistic to be swept away. I think that's exactly why they picked me. The interview room was brighter than heaven and colder than a morgue. It didn't look like a security office. It looked like a surgical theater scrubbed down with bleach. I sat on the edge of a hard plastic chair, trying to tuck my cracked work boots underneath the seat where the fluorescent lights wouldn't catch the mud caked on the soles. I was painfully aware of my own scent, stale sweat, fast food wrappers, and the musty upholstery of the car that had become my coffin. The man across from me didn't introduce himself. He wore a gray suit that fit too perfectly and smelled of nothing, just expensive soap and chemical antiseptic. He didn't offer a hand to shake. He didn't offer water. He just sat behind a steel desk that looked like a slab of ice and stared at me with eyes that were observant but completely empty. "Mr. Richardson," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of humanity, like a GPS giving turn-by-turn directions to a funeral. "We represent a classified extension of Wright Patterson Air Force Base. Sector 7 is a primary hub for research, development, and acquisition programs. What we acquire, we keep. What we develop, we contain." He slid a thick stack of papers across the metal surface. The pages were heavy bond paper, stark white against the gray desk. "This is a standard Level 5 non-disclosure agreement," he recited, looking at a spot on the wall just above my left shoulder. "Whatever you see at Sector 7 stays at Sector 7. If you talk, we sue. If you post online, we sue. If you tell your family, we fine them." I looked down at the packet. The words swam a little. I saw phrases like biological containment, hazard pay, and waiver of liability regarding unpredictable fauna. A smarter man would have asked questions. A man with something to lose would have stood up and walked out. But I wasn't a man anymore. I was a stomach and a shivering spine. All I could see was the salary figure printed on the first page. It had 3 zeros on the weekly rate. It was enough to fix my transmission. It was enough for a deposit on a studio apartment where the heat worked. It was enough to make me feel real again. "Do you have family in the state, Mr. Richardson?" the suit asked. It wasn't polite conversation. He was checking the boxes. He was assessing the blast radius if I disappeared. "No," I lied. Or maybe it wasn't a lie. My parents were gone, and the girl I thought I'd marry had left 2 years ago when the money ran out. I was untethered. "Good," he said, and for a second, a flicker of something like satisfaction crossed his bland face. "Ideally, our contractors are unencumbered. The location is remote. Isolation is part of the job description." He didn't need a guard. I realized that as I picked up the pen. He needed a warm body. He needed someone disposable, someone who could vanish into the dark woods of Kentucky without triggering a police investigation. I was perfect because I was already gone. I signed my name on the dotted line. The ink flowed black and permanent. The man snatched the papers back the second the pen lifted from the page, sliding them into a folder as if I had ceased to exist the moment the transaction was complete. "Report to these coordinates at 2200 hours," he said, sliding a small index card across the table. "Do not be late. The gate locks from the inside." As I walked out of that sterile building and back into the humid afternoon, a cold shiver ran down my spine. It felt less like I had just landed a job, and more like I had just sold something I could never buy back. I clutched the index card with the coordinates for the Daniel Boone National Forest, feeling the weight of the mistake settling in my gut. I was hollow when I walked in, but as I walked out, I felt filled with a heavy, suffocating dread. I had asked for salvation, but I had a feeling I had just signed a death warrant. The drive to Sector 7 took 3 hours of winding darkness. It wasn't on Google Maps, and the moment I passed the last gas station, my GPS signal died with a pathetic beep. I had to navigate by a crumpled sheet of printed coordinates that led me deep into the black heart of the Wright Patterson National Forest. The pavement turned to gravel, and the gravel dissolved into rutted dirt that threatened to tear the muffler off my sedan. The ancient trees grew taller and closer together, choking out the moonlight until the road felt like a tunnel descending into the throat of the earth. My car, a rusted relic that served as both my transport and my bedroom, groaned in protest as the incline steepened. I was alone. There were no road signs here, no reflectors, no evidence that civilization had ever touched this place, except for the tire tracks I was following. A deep sense of unease settled in my stomach, heavier than the hunger I'd been ignoring. This wasn't just a remote job site for acquisition programs. This was a place that didn't want to be found. The dirt track ended abruptly, terminated by a structure that had no business existing in the middle of a national forest. My headlights washed over a massive barrier of steel and chain link that stretched into the darkness on either side of the road, cutting through the timber like a scar. It looked less like a corporate entrance and more like a prison wall dropped into the wilderness. Standing in front of the gate, illuminated by the harsh yellow glare of my high beams, was a man who looked like he had been chiseled out of the same mountain stone as the cliffs behind him. I rolled the car to a stop, the gravel crunching loudly. The man didn't flinch. He didn't shield his eyes from the light. He just stood there, arms crossed over a chest that looked as solid as an oiled drum. This was Donald. He was older than me, maybe in his 50s, with a face that was a map of hard living. His nose had been broken at least once, healing crooked and flat against a face covered in gray stubble. Even from inside the car, protected by glass and steel, I felt intimidated. I rolled down the window, and the smell hit me instantly. Not the damp forest rot I had smelled earlier, but a pungent mix of stale tobacco and gun oil. Donald didn't say a word at first. He leaned his head to the side and spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dust near my front tire. Then, with a sigh that sounded like a heavy door closing, he produced a massive ring of keys and turned to the padlock securing the chain link. The chain rattled as he pulled the gate open, the metal groaning on unoiled hinges. He waved me through with a sharp, impatient gesture, his eyes scanning the tree line behind me rather than looking at my face. I eased the sedan forward. As I passed under the arch of the gate, I looked up. The fence was impressive, easily 12 feet high, topped with coils of razor wire that gleamed wetly in my headlights. But as I craned my neck, a cold knot formed in my stomach. I had worked construction sites before. I knew how security fences worked. The barbed wire on top is always angled outward toward the threat to prevent people from climbing in. The wire at Sector 7 was different. The jagged steel coils were tilted inward. I tapped the brakes, staring up at the metal thorns. They weren't trying to keep meth heads or copper thieves out of the facility. They were trying to keep something inside. "Welcome to the jagged edge, kid," Donald rumbled as I pulled the car fully into the compound. He slammed the heavy gate shut behind my bumper, the sound echoing like a gunshot. I parked next to the guard shack and stepped out. The air here felt charged, pressurized, like the moments before a thunderstorm. "That fence," I said, pointing up at the razor wire, "it's backward." Donald locked the gate and turned to me. His sunken eyes were serious. "It's not backward," he said. "It's containment, but out here, containment is a joke." He walked over to the guard shack and patted the thick concrete wall. "You think we're guarding a research lab, don't you? Some place where guys in white coats invent new drones." The contract said research, development, and acquisition. I replied, feeling foolish. Donald laughed, a dry, barking sound. "Acquisition, that's a nice word for it. It means they stole something from nature that they couldn't control." He looked out into the pitch-black woods surrounding the lit perimeter. "This isn't a zoo, Richardson, and the asset out there. He isn't an animal." "What is he?" I asked. Donald leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He's a king, and he commands a legion. The fence isn't to keep him in the woods. It's to buy us time when he decides to take his throne back." The guard shack wasn't an office. It was a concrete bunker with windows made of bulletproof glass thick enough to distort the dark woods outside. Inside, the air was stagnant, recycled, and heavy with the smell of stale coffee and the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil. A bank of monitors hummed against the back wall, cycling through grainy black and white feeds of the perimeter fence, showing nothing but static and swaying trees. Donald tossed a heavy ring of keys and a Motorola radio onto the metal desk between us. They landed with a loud clatter that made me flinch. He sank into a worn swivel chair that groaned under his weight, spinning around to face me. The granite facade of his face cracked just enough to let the fear show through. "You need to know what you're standing in front of, Richardson," Donald said, his voice a low rumble. "This isn't just a secure site. It's a tomb for a mistake called Project Garm." I leaned against the cold concrete wall, crossing my arms to hide the fact that my hands were shaking. "Project Garm? Is that what the wolf thing is?" Donald shook his head slowly. "They aren't wolves, not anymore. The government wanted a new kind of asset for acquisition programs, something that could hunt in terrain where drones fail and soldiers die. They took wolf DNA and spliced it with something else, something smarter. They wanted a weapon that could follow orders." He laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Instead, they created a hierarchy. They created a king." He pointed a thick finger at the dark window. "The alpha out there, the one I call the king. He doesn't hunt for food. We aren't prey to him, we're just obstacles. He hunts for a specific target. He's trying to retrieve something they took from him." "What did they take?" I asked. Donald ignored the question. He leaned forward, the smell of tobacco heavy on his breath. "Listen close. To survive the night, you have to follow the rules. Not the handbook junk the suit gave you. The real rules." He held up 3 calloused fingers. "Rule 1, he said, ticking the first finger down. "We do patrols in the vehicle only, never on foot. I don't care if you have a flat tire. I don't care if the engine catches fire. You stay inside the steel cage. If you step out, you disappear." I nodded. That seemed easy enough. "Rule 2, he continued, dropping a second finger. "Watch the eyes. When your high beams hit the woods, you're going to see reflections. Red is a deer, green is a coyote, but if you see eyes reflecting amber, you kill your lights, you put the truck in reverse, and you drive back here immediately." "Amber," I repeated, "because that's the king." "Because that's the scout," Donald corrected. "If you see amber eyes, the pack is already flanking you." He paused then, his hand trembling slightly as he held up the final finger. The air in the shack seemed to get colder. "Rule 3, he whispered. "If you hear a woman singing in the woods, do not investigate. Do not roll down your window. Do not try to help her." I frowned, confusion overriding my fear for a second. "A woman? Is there a hiker lost out there?" Donald went pale. The blood drained from his face so fast it looked like he was about to pass out. He lowered his hand and gripped the armrests of his chair until his knuckles turned white. "It is not a hiker," he said, his voice straining. "It is a summons. She sings to call him. She sings to keep him calm. If you hear that lullaby, it means she is awake, and if she is awake, the king is coming for her." "Who is she?" I asked, stepping closer to the desk. "Is she a prisoner?" Donald stood up abruptly, the chair skidding back against the wall. He looked at me with eyes wide with terror, refusing to speak. He wouldn't say her name. He acted as if speaking it aloud would summon the monsters right to the door. "Get in the truck, Richardson," he snapped, turning his back to me to stare at the monitors. "Your shift starts now, and pray you don't hear the music." At 2200 hours, I climbed into the cab of the company truck, a battered SUV with a reinforced steel cage separating the front seats from the back. The interior smelled of stale sweat and whatever industrial cleaner they used to scrub the floor mats. I turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life, shaking the frame like a wet dog. I pulled away from the guard shack, leaving Donald and the only pool of yellow floodlight for 20 miles behind me. As I rolled onto the perimeter road, the darkness swallowed the rearview mirror. Sector 7 was massive. Donald hadn't exaggerated about the isolation. To my left, the inward-facing razor wire gleamed like teeth in the moonlight, protecting the concrete bunker that housed the government's acquisition programs. To my right, the Wright Patterson National Forest was a wall of absolute black. My high beams cut a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the trunks of ancient oaks and the swaying fronds of ferns, but the light seemed to die just a few yards past the road, choked out by the density of the woods. I drove slowly, keeping the speedometer under 10, my eyes darting between the gravel track and the impenetrable tree line. I was looking for eyes, red for deer, green for coyote. Every shadow looked like a shape, every swaying branch looked like a limb. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, telling myself I was being paranoid. Donald was just a burnout, a veteran guard trying to scare the rookie to pass the time. I rolled the window down an inch to let in some fresh air. The forest was loud. It was a chaotic symphony of biology, the rhythmic droning of tree frogs, the sharp chirps of crickets, the rustle of the wind shaking the canopy. It was the sound of a living ecosystem, relentless and noisy. Then halfway through the loop on the northern ridge, the world ended. It didn't happen gradually. It happened instantly. One second the woods were screaming with life, the next they were dead silent. It was as if someone had severed the audio cable to reality. The crickets cut out mid-chirp. The wind died. Even the gravel under my tires seemed to get quieter, the sound dampened by a sudden, oppressive heaviness in the air. I slammed on the brakes. The silence wasn't empty, it was pressurized. It pushed against my eardrums, a physical weight that made my head throb. This was the Oz effect. Hunters talk about it. The moment an apex predator enters an area and every smaller creature freezes to avoid becoming prey. But this wasn't just a predator nearby. This felt like the entire forest was holding its breath in terror. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, straining my ears for a twig snap, a bird call, anything. My own breathing sounded like a hurricane in the small cabin. I reached for the radio to call Donald, just to hear a human voice break the tension. But before I could key the mic, the speaker crackled to life on its own. It wasn't static, it was a melody. A soft, haunting humming filled the cabin. It wasn't a pop song or radio interference. It was a lullaby, slow and melancholic, like a woman humming to a child she would never see again. It drifted through the speaker with a clarity that shouldn't have been possible. I froze, my hand hovering over the dashboard. Rule 3. If you hear a woman singing, do not investigate. But I couldn't turn it off. The sound hooked into something deep inside me. It didn't make me feel fear, not at first. It made me feel an intense, crushing wave of sadness. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes. I felt a profound sense of loss, a loneliness so sharp it stole the breath from my lungs. It felt like standing at a graveside in the rain. "Donald," I whispered, my voice trembling, is that the radio?" The humming stopped abruptly. The silence returned, thicker than before. Then the static popped, a sharp burst of white noise that made me jump. A voice cut through the speaker. It wasn't the woman. It was deep, guttural, and distorted, like a machine trying to learn the shape of human words. "She is here." The voice vibrated the plastic casing of the radio. It sounded ancient and hungry. I dropped the radio as if it had burned me. I slammed my hand onto the lock button, ensuring all 4 doors were secured. I grabbed the spotlight handle attached to the driver's side pillar and swung the beam frantically toward the tree line. The light swept over the gray trunks and the dense undergrowth. Nothing. But the silence held, and in the dark, just beyond the reach of my light, I felt the weight of something massive watching me, something that had been waiting a long time for that song. I slammed the truck into drive and floored it, gravel spraying behind me as I tore back toward the guard shack, praying Donald was still there. I drove like a man possessed, the SUV sliding sideways around the gravel curves as I tore back toward the main gate. I needed to see the yellow safety lights of the guard shack. I needed to hear Donald tell me I was hallucinating, that the lullaby and the mechanical voice were just interference from the acquisition equipment buried in the bunker. But when the shack came into view, my stomach dropped through the floorboards. The floodlights were dead. The small concrete block that served as our fortress was a dark square silhouette against the night sky. The only illumination came from my headlights as I skidded to a halt, the beams cutting through the dust to reveal a scene of absolute violence. The heavy steel door of the shack wasn't just open, it was gone. It had been ripped from the frame and thrown 10 feet into the gravel, twisted like a piece of tin foil. "Donald," I screamed, forgetting the rules, forgetting the silence. "Donald, answer me." Nothing but the hiss of my own engine and the settling dust. I grabbed the heavy maglite from the center console, took a breath that tasted of fear and copper, and stepped out into the night. The silence of the woods was still heavy, pressing against my ears, but now there was a new smell. It hit me before I even reached the threshold, a thick, metallic stench of blood mixed with that heavy, musky odor of wet fur. I stepped inside the shack, sweeping the beam of my flashlight across the room. The place was a wreck. The coffee pot was shattered on the linoleum, a brown puddle spreading toward the wall. The chair Donald had been sitting in was overturned, but it was the wall that made me freeze. A wide smear of red, dark and glistening in the flashlight beam, stretched across the bank of monitors. Suddenly, a low hum filled the room as the backup generator kicked in. One of the security monitors flickered to life, showing a frozen image of the room I was standing in. It was the internal security feed. I shouldn't have looked. I should have run back to the truck and driven through the fence. But I reached out, my trembling finger hitting the rewind button. The timestamp rolled back 10 minutes. On the screen, Donald was sitting in his chair, staring at the door. He looked terrified. He had his baton in one hand and the radio in the other. He wasn't patrolling, he was waiting. Then the wall exploded. The camera's frame rate was too low to catch the entry clearly, but the steel door flew inward as if hit by a battering ram. A massive shape stepped into the frame. It wasn't a bear and it wasn't a wolf. It stood on 2 legs, towering over 7 feet tall, its massive shoulders scraping the ceiling tiles. It was covered in matted gray fur, but its posture was terrifyingly human. It didn't hunch like an animal. It stood straight, regal and imposing. Across its chest and snout were thick white scars, surgical marks from the enhancements Donald had hinted at. This was the king. Donald stood up, swinging the baton. It was a useless gesture. The king reached out with a hand, not a paw, but a hand with long black claws, and caught the weapon mid-swing. With a casual flick of its wrist, it tossed the baton aside. Then it grabbed Donald by the throat. Donald was a big man, over 200 pounds of solid granite, but the creature lifted him off the floor effortlessly, pinning him against the wall. The camera zoomed in slightly, the focus sharpening on the beast's face. Its eyes burned with a horrifying human intelligence. It wasn't looking at Donald with hunger, it was looking at him with interrogation. The beast leaned in, its snout inches from Donald's face. Its lips curled back, revealing rows of serrated teeth, but it didn't bite. It spoke. The sound was distorted on the recording, a deep, grinding rumble that vibrated through the shack's speakers. Key. I froze. It wasn't mimicking a sound it heard. It was asking a question. Donald kicked his legs, his face turning purple. He shook his head, spitting blood at the monster. "Go to hell," he wheezed. The king's expression didn't change. There was no anger, only a cold, efficient resolve. "Key," the beast repeated, louder this time. Donald refused again, reaching for his belt, maybe trying to find a weapon that wasn't there. The king seemed to sigh, a puff of breath fogging the camera lens. "Useless," the monster growled. With a sudden, violent jerk of its arm, the king snapped Donald's neck. He dropped the body to the floor like a sack of trash, stepping over him without a second glance. The creature turned its head, looking directly at the camera, looking directly at me, before turning and walking out into the night. The screen went ecstatic. I stood in the dark shack, the silence ringing in my ears. The king wasn't just a monster. He was a soldier on a mission. He was looking for the key to the bunker. And as I looked down at the desk, I realized with a jolt of terror that the master ring of keys Donald usually carried was gone. The king didn't kill him for food. He killed him because he didn't have what he needed. And now he was heading for the castle to get his queen. "We have to move," I said, grabbing Dr. Vance's arm. Her lab coat was pristine, a stark contrast to the grime and blood staining my uniform, but her hands were ice cold. "If he's coming for you, we can't be here when he arrives." "He knows I'm out of the cell," she whispered, her eyes darting to the ceiling as a heavy thud vibrated through the facility's ventilation shafts. "He can smell the change in the air. The king never loses a scent." I didn't wait for her to explain the biology of the monster she had married. I pulled her toward the emergency stairwell at the far end of the warehouse floor. The schematic I'd seen in the guard shack, back when I thought this was just a job, showed a sub-basement maintenance tunnel that fed into a drainage outflow. It was a straight shot to the creek bed outside the fence. It was our only chance. We took the metal stairs two at a time, the clanging of our footsteps echoing like dinner bells in the silent facility. We hit the bottom landing and burst into a narrow concrete corridor lined with hissing pipes and thick bundles of cables. The air down here was different. It was hot, humid, and smelled of sulfur and wet animal fur. "The outflow is at the end of the hall," I panted, sweeping my flashlight beam through the steam rising from the floor grates. We made it 20 feet before the shadows at the end of the hallway detached themselves from the walls. They weren't the king. They were smaller, leaner, standing about 6 feet tall on hind legs that looked unnervingly powerful. Their fur was a mottled black and gray, designed for camouflage in the deep woods. These were the pack, the legion Donald had warned me about. They didn't growl or roar. They moved with the silent, synchronized efficiency of a tactical strike team. There were 3 of them. 2 moved to the sides, flanking us, crawling along the pipes on the walls with hooked claws, while the 3rd stood directly in front of the heavy steel blast door that was our only exit. Amy stopped dead, her breath hitching. "Lieutenants," she whimpered, "they aren't here to kill me. They're hurting us." The one blocking the door stepped forward, its amber eyes locking onto me. It didn't look at Amy. It knew she was the prize. I was just the packaging that needed to be discarded. It bared its teeth, a low, vibrating, chuffing sound emanating from its chest, a signal to attack. I looked around frantically for a weapon. My baton was gone. My gun was back in the truck. I was holding nothing but a heavy-duty maglite and a ring of useless keys. The wolf on the wall lunged. I shoved Amy behind me and swung the heavy flashlight, catching the creature in midair with a glancing blow to the snout. It yelped, a surprisingly high-pitched sound, and scrambled back, claws sparking against the concrete floor. But the one guarding the door took the opportunity to close the distance. It was fast, blurring through the steam. It swiped at me, its claws tearing through the sleeve of my jacket and carving hot lines into my forearm. I shouted in pain, stumbling back against the wall of pipes. The creature loomed over me, ready to finish the job, its jaws snapping inches from my face. That's when I heard the hiss. Directly next to my head, a brass valve on a rusted vertical pipe was leaking a jet of white vapor. The warning label, peeled and yellowed red high-pressure steam, "Do not touch." The wolf lunged again, its jaws aiming for my throat. I didn't think. I dropped to one knee, dodging the bite, and swung the heavy metal butt of the maglite with every ounce of desperate strength I had left. I didn't aim for the wolf, I aimed for the brass valve. Clang, the metal dented. The wolf roared, confused, raising a claw to gut me. I swung again, crack. The valve sheared off completely. A concentrated jet of superheated steam, pressurized to industrial standards, erupted from the broken pipe. It blasted directly into the face and chest of the pack lieutenant. The sound that came out of the creature wasn't a growl. It was a scream, a human-sounding shriek of agony that shook the dust from the ceiling pipes. The steam scalded its eyes and snout instantly. The wolf thrashed blindly, clawing at its own face, retreating rapidly down the hallway away from the hissing white cloud. The other two wolves hesitated, confused by the sudden brutality and the wall of blinding vapor. "Go," I screamed, grabbing Amy's hand. We dove through the steam, the heat blistering my skin, and reached the heavy blast door. I grabbed the rusted iron wheel in the center. It groaned, fighting me, fused by years of neglect. "Turn it," Amy yelled, looking back as the other wolves regained their composure and charged. I braced my boot against the frame and heaved. The rust snapped. The wheel spun. I threw the locking mechanism and hauled the heavy steel door open just wide enough for us to squeeze through. I shoved Amy into the dark tunnel and scrambled in after her, grabbing the inside handle. A set of claws raked against the steel, inches from my fingers, as I slammed the door shut and spun the inner locking wheel. A heavy body slammed against the other side, booming like a drum, but the steel held. We were alone in the dark, gasping for air, the sound of the enraged pack muffled by 4 inches of reinforced metal. I shone my light down the tunnel. It was round, slick with algae, and stretched into the blackness. "That won't hold them forever," I rasped, clutching my bleeding arm. "It doesn't have to," Amy whispered, staring into the dark. "It just has to hold them long enough for the king to catch up." The drainage tunnel spat us out into a muddy ravine about a mile from the compound. The air was freezing, biting at my sweat-soaked skin, but it smelled sweet, like wet leaves and freedom, untainted by the copper stench of the facility. I scrambled up the slick bank, digging my boots into the mud, hauling Dr. Vance up behind me. "We made it," I gasped, pointing through a break in the trees. About 200 yards away, moonlight reflected off the black asphalt of the state highway. It was the lifeline back to the real world. "If we can flag down a truck, we're gone." Amy didn't answer. She wasn't looking at the road. She was standing perfectly still, staring up at the ridge line that separated us from the highway. The wind had died again. The crickets, which had just started chirping, fell instantly silent. The pressure in the air returned, heavy and suffocating. I slowly shone my dying flashlight toward the ridge. Standing silhouetted against the full moon was a shadow that blocked out the sky. The Alpha King dropped from the ledge, landing in the mud 20 feet in front of us with a heavy, wet thud that shook the ground. He didn't roar. He didn't charge. He simply rose to his full height, unfurling like a nightmare made of muscle and gray fur. In the open air, he was even more terrifying than he had been on the security monitors. He was a mountain of scarring and power, his breath fogging in the cold night air, his amber eyes burning with an intelligence that no animal should possess. I stepped in front of Amy, raising the heavy metal flashlight like a club, though I knew it was as useless as a toothpick against a tank. "Run," I hissed to her. "Head for the trees, I'll distract him." The king didn't even acknowledge me. He didn't growl at my weapon. He didn't track my movements. His gaze was fixed entirely on the woman standing behind me. He took a step forward, his massive claws sinking into the soft earth. "He's not going to let us leave, Richardson," Amy whispered. Her voice wasn't fearful anymore. It was resigned. "We can make it," I said, my voice cracking. "Just run." Amy stepped out from behind me. She walked past my outstretched arm, moving toward the monster. "No," I shouted, reaching for her. "Amy, stop." She turned to look at me, and the expression on her face stopped me cold. She was crying, but she wasn't screaming. It was a look of profound, heartbreaking sorrow. "Go," she said softly. "He doesn't want you. He never wanted you." She turned back to the beast. The king towered over her, his chest heaving, a low rumble building in his throat that vibrated through the soles of my boots. He looked ready to tear the world apart, but as Amy stepped into his shadow, he froze. She reached up, her pale hand trembling, and placed her palm against the king's matted, scarred snout. I flinched, expecting her arm to be ripped off. Instead, the king let out a sound that I will never forget as long as I live. It wasn't a growl. It was a whimper, a high, broken sound of recognition. The rage in his amber eyes dissolved, replaced by a desperate, possessive longing. He leaned his massive head into her hand, closing his eyes, inhaling her scent as if it were the only oxygen in the world. "I'm here," she whispered to the monster. "I'm here, my love." The king opened his eyes and looked at me. For a second the intelligence flared, a clear warning. He bared his teeth just once, telling me that my part in this story was over. He reached down, his movements surprisingly gentle for a creature of such violence, and scooped Amy up into his arms. She didn't fight him. She buried her face in the coarse fur of his chest, surrendering to the creature the government had turned her husband into. He held her tight against him, possessing her completely, reclaiming the queen they had tried to keep in a glass cage. Then, with a powerful thrust of his legs, he turned and bounded up the ridge, disappearing back into the deep, dark woods of Sector 7, taking the only thing he had ever really wanted with him. I stood alone in the mud, shivering in the returning wind, listening to the fatting sound of heavy footsteps carrying a tragedy back into the dark. I scrambled onto the asphalt of the highway, my lungs burning and my boots caked in the mud of the ravine. I didn't have to wait long. Twin beams of light crested the hill, blinding white in the darkness, accompanied by the roar of a diesel engine. I stood right in the middle of the lane, waving my arms frantically. The air horn blasted, a deafening, earth-shaking roar, and I heard the screech of air brakes as the massive rig locked its wheels. The trailer jackknifed slightly, sliding sideways as the truck ground to a halt just 10 feet from where I stood. I didn't wait for an invitation. I scrambled up to the cab, ripping the passenger door open. "Drive," I screamed, pulling myself into the seat. "Just drive." The driver, a heavy-set man with wide, terrified eyes, was clutching a tire iron like a baseball bat. He looked at my shredded uniform, the blood on my arm, and the wild terror in my eyes. He didn't ask questions. He slammed the gearshift into place and floored it. As we lurched forward, I looked into the side mirror. The road behind us was empty. The king hadn't chased me. He had what he wanted. I had the trucker drop me off at a diner 2 towns over, near the Ohio border. I didn't go to the police. I didn't go to a hospital. I hitchhiked north, putting as many miles as I could between myself and the Wright Patterson National Forest. I found a cheap motel in a town that didn't feel like it had a name, paid cash for a week, and wedged a chair under the doorknob. I spent 3 days jumping at every shadow and flinching every time the ice machine rattled down the hall. I kept waiting for the news reports: missing security guard, missing scientist, massacre at a government facility. But there was nothing. The world kept turning, completely unaware of the monsters living in its backyard. On the fourth morning, I woke up to a sound softer than a whisper, the friction of paper sliding across the carpet. There was no knock, no footsteps, just a plain white envelope lying on the floor, having been slipped under the gap of the door. I stared at it for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs, before I finally worked up the courage to pick it up. There was no return address, no stamp. It had been hand-delivered. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000. Attached to the check was a single sheet of typed paper, crisp and white. It didn't offer an apology. It didn't mention the NDA. It was a receipt for a transaction I hadn't known I was part of. Regarding Sector 7 Asset Management. Payment constitutes full settlement of all liability claims. Status: subject retrieved. Contract closed. I dropped the paper as if it were coated in poison. Subject retrieved. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The inward-facing fences, the restless king, the containment protocols that failed so easily, it was all a setup. They hadn't lost control of Sector 7. They had orchestrated it. They knew the king wouldn't leave without Amy, and they knew he couldn't get to her as long as she was locked in the bunker. I wasn't a guard. Donald wasn't a guard. We were distractions. We were the fresh meat sent in to keep the pack occupied, to create chaos, to force the king to breach the facility so he could retrieve the subject they could no longer control. They wanted him to take her. They wanted the problem to disappear into the woods so they could wash their hands of it. I looked at the check. It was enough to start over. It was enough to buy a new car, a new name, a new life. But then I closed my eyes and saw Amy's face. I saw the way she touched the monster's snout. I saw the sacrifice she made, not to save herself, but to save me. I sat down at the wobbly desk and opened my laptop. I cashed the check electronically. You can't fight a war on an empty stomach, but I wasn't going to be silent. I pulled up an encrypted forum, a dark corner of the web frequented by whistleblowers and conspiracy theorists. I typed out everything: the coordinates, the inward-facing fences, the mimicking voice on the radio, and the truth about the Alpha King and his queen. My finger hovered over the enter key. I glanced out the window through a crack in the blinds. Across the street, parked in the shadows of a closed gas station, was a black sedan. Two men in gray suits stood by the hood, smoking cigarettes. They weren't looking at the motel, but I knew they were watching. They were the cleanup crew. They were waiting to see if I would take the money and disappear, or if they needed to initiate a different kind of acquisition. I smiled, a cold, hard expression that felt like Donald. I hit upload. If you are reading this, the files are out there. Don't go looking for Sector 7. Don't listen to the lullaby in the woods. And if you ever see a job listing for overnight security with hazard pay, run. But more importantly, remember Amy Vance. Remember that even in the darkest places on Earth, where the government builds monsters, love is the only thing that remains human. They found me. Now they're going to come for you.